Between two rivers. That's what humanity needed to invent civilization. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, in a strip of land that we now call Iraq, something that had never existed before emerged more than 5,000 years ago. Cities, written laws, calendars, mathematics, literature. The first poem in history was written here. The first legal code was recorded here. The first human beings who looked at the sky and named the stars lived here. Mesopotamia was not just another ancient civilization, it was the engine that ignited all the others. And yet, this extraordinary civilization disappeared. Not suddenly, not in an epic battle, it faded slowly, like a flame that the wind consumes until it is too late. In this first episode, we will understand what made Mesopotamia so special, how it built the first urban world in history, and what was the silent poison that began to kill its land long before any invader arrived. Imagine you've never seen a city, that you were born in a time when humans were constantly on the move, following animals, searching for water, camping under the stars. This was the life of virtually all of humanity for tens of thousands of years. And then, around 4000 BC, something changes in that corner of the world between two rivers. The Sumerians stop. They decide to stay. What they build next is the most audacious experiment in the history of our species. They build Uruk, the first great city, which came to house more than 50,000 people, an unprecedented concentration of humanity. For this agglomeration to function, they had to invent something new: social order. And order required rules. The rules required someone to write them down. Thus was born cuneiform writing, traced with a reed pen on soft clay tablets. The earliest texts in history weren't romantic poems, they were records of grains, lists of barley, oil, livestock. Before art, accounting. But it wasn't long before the rest followed. In Sumer, Ziggurats flourished, stepped towers that rose above the plain like artificial mountains. These structures were not just temples, they were astronomical observatories and administrative centers. From atop these towers, priests built the world's first astronomical system. They identified constellations, calculated lunar cycles with surprising accuracy, and established a calendar. They divided the day into 24 hours, the hour into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds, a sexagesimal system that we still use today, more than 5,000 years later. They had doctors who performed surgeries, engineers who designed sophisticated canals, judges who enforced written laws, merchants who traded as far as the Indus Valley. And they had literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written more than 4,000 years ago, tells the story of a king who seeks immortality. A story that could have been written yesterday, dealing with the fear of death, the pain of loss, and the search for meaning. But such a brilliant civilization doesn't die by accident. It dies from accumulation. And the first symptoms of decline appeared in a place no one would suspect, in the soil they cultivated. The first major problem in Mesopotamia was something the Sumerians themselves created with their own hands. Their irrigation system, that engineering marvel that transformed the arid plain into fertile land, had a fatal flaw. The water flowing through the canals contained dissolved minerals, mainly salts. As it evaporated under the scorching sun, the water left small deposits of salt in the ground. For years, decades, they were insignificant. But over centuries of continuous irrigation, the salt accumulated silently and unstoppably. The cuneiform records are eloquent. Around 2400 BC, the proportion of wheat and barley planted was equivalent. 5 centuries later, wheat had practically disappeared. Barley, more resistant to salinity, was the only cereal that still grew. And by around 1700 BC, even barley was beginning to fail over large areas. This, in human terms, meant only one thing: famine. But not a sudden famine, a slow, persistent famine that corroded society from within. Children grew up with less nutrition. Adults had less energy. Productivity fell. The taxes that sustained the state and the temples decreased. Cities began to shrink. Entire populations were abandoned, not by invaders, but simply because there wasn't enough food. And here is the tragic irony. The Sumerians were the greatest hydraulic engineers of the ancient world. They knew how to bring water to their fields. What they didn't know was that they were slowly poisoning the land that sustained them. And this poisoning, accumulated over 2 millennia, was one of the factors that made Mesopotamia vulnerable to everything that would come after. The land that nourished the first civilization began to betray its children. But soil degradation was only the first chapter. Because while the land slowly deteriorated, politics burned rapidly. Mesopotamia was never a unified state. It was a mosaic of rival city-states, each with its own gods, kings, and ambitions. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, all competed for land, water, and trade routes, and in this incessant competition, the region's resources were constantly drained. It was in this scenario of fragmentation and wear and tear that a man emerged who decided to break this balance forever. Sargon of Akkad, around 2300 BC, not only conquered the Sumerian cities, he unified them under a single power. Thus was born the first empire of humanity. But empires have a fundamental problem. They are living organisms that need to constantly feed on conquests. When they stop growing, they begin to weaken. And when they weaken, all those who were waiting on the sidelines see their opportunity. In the next episode, we will see how Sargon's dream fell apart, how Mesopotamia rose from the ashes, and how the famous Code of Hammurabi tried, unsuccessfully, to create an eternal order. The first great fall was already on its way.